The rain fell over the towering spires of Vermillion in heavy, relentless sheets. From the highest window of the Grand Archives, Evelyn Vance watched the sprawling city below. The cobblestone streets were illuminated by the faint blue glow of ether lamps, casting long, wavering shadows that danced like restless spirits in the downpour. Evelyn turned away from the cold glass, her focus returning to the heavy oak desk in the center of her private sanctum. Upon it rested her latest obsession, a magnificent puzzle box forged from an unknown, iridescent metal. It was a relic from the First Age, rumored to predate the Great Flood that had swallowed the Old World over 1,000 years ago. Evelyn adjusted her brass-rimmed spectacles, leaning close to examine the intricate grooves of the artifact. Her fingers, stained with dark ink and smelling faintly of ozone and aged parchment, traced the delicate, sweeping engravings. She had spent the last 48 hours completely awake, sustained only by bitter black tea and an unrelenting need to crack the cipher. The box was not merely a decorative container. It was a map, and if the ancient texts she had translated were accurate, it pointed toward the sunken vault, a mythical repository of limitless knowledge and raw power that the city's elite had spent centuries trying to erase from the historical record. "You are holding it upside down, Evelyn." The voice came from the deep shadows near the towering bookshelves, smooth as velvet and entirely uninvited. Evelyn did not jump. She simply closed her eyes for a fleeting second, releasing a soft, weary sigh before turning around. Stepping into the dim light of the study was Clara Thorne. Clara wore a tailored midnight blue coat, the heavy collar turned up against the damp air, her dark hair falling in loose, rebellious waves around her striking face. Her leather boots left absolutely no trace on the polished wooden floor, a silent testament to her profession as Vermillion's most infamous smuggler and thief. Clara possessed a smile that was equal parts undeniable charm and lethal danger, and right now, that very smile was directed squarely at Evelyn. "It is a spherical object, Clara," Evelyn replied, keeping her tone perfectly level despite the sudden racing of her pulse. "There is no upside down." "A technicality," Clara said, closing the distance between them with a slow, predatory grace. "But it sounds much better to say you are holding it wrong. It establishes dominance and makes me seem infinitely more knowledgeable." Evelyn crossed her arms, fiercely ignoring the sudden, traitorous flutter deep in her chest. It was always exactly like this with Clara. They were academic rivals who had turned into bitter enemies, or perhaps they were enemies who secretly harbored a frustrating mutual respect. The lines between hatred and desire had blurred dangerously during the disaster in Oakhaven 3 years ago, a memory Evelyn fiercely kept locked away in the darkest corners of her mind. "How did you bypass the security wards?" Evelyn asked, her sharp gaze sweeping over Clara, searching for any signs of injury or a struggle. "The front doors are enchanted with heavy blood magic, and the tall windows are laced with kinetic tripwires." "I have my secret ways," Clara murmured, but stopping just a few inches from the edge of the desk. She leaned forward, the intoxicating scent of rain, oiled leather, and something uniquely sweet washing over Evelyn. "Besides, you should know by now that no lock in this entire city can keep me away from a valuable prize. Or away from you, for that matter." Evelyn swallowed hard, planting her feet firmly and refusing to take a single step back. "You are not taking the relic. I found it in the ruins of the lower sector. It belongs to the archives. It belongs to no one, and certainly not to a miserable museum of dust and dead men," Clara countered, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden fierce intensity. "You do not understand what you have sitting on that desk, Evelyn. That is not just a map. It is a key. And if Governor Silas finds out you possess it, you will not live to see the sunrise. Evelyn stiffened immediately at the mention of the city's ruthless and terrifying leader. Governor Silas controlled the entire ether supply, and by extension, he controlled every life in Vermillion. His personal enforcers, known throughout the districts as the Brass Watch, were notorious for making political dissidents disappear into the sprawling, toxic network of canals beneath the city streets. "I am a sanctioned scholar of the highest order," Evelyn said, though her voice noticeably lacked its usual iron conviction. "The governor cannot touch me without provoking the immense ire of the High Council." Clara let out a sharp, deeply cynical laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. "The High Council is completely in his pocket, you beautiful fool. They sold you out exactly 2 hours ago. Why do you think I am here? I did not brave the storm and break into the most heavily guarded tower in the district to steal the artifact. I broke in to save your impossibly stubborn life." Evelyn stared at her, trying to read the micro-expressions on Clara's face. She looked for the lie, the con, the trick that Clara was so famous for playing. But she found only genuine, unmasked urgency. Before Evelyn could fully process the terrifying gravity of Clara's words, a heavy, resounding thud echoed up from the lower levels of the Grand Archives. It was the unmistakable, violent sound of a reinforced iron door being brutally breached. The massive stone building shuddered, and a faint, mechanical alarm began to wail, emitting a high and piercing note that violently cut through the quiet night. "They are here," Clara said, her playful and teasing demeanor vanishing in a single instant. She reached into her dark coat and quickly drew a sleek, silver-plated percussion pistol, checking the chamber with an expert flick of her wrist. "We have less than 3 minutes before they reach this floor." Evelyn stared at the thick wooden door of her study, her brilliant mind racing through a dozen impossible scenarios. "My research documents, my entire life's work is in this room." "Your life's work will not matter a single bit if you are dead," Clara snapped, reaching across the desk and grabbing Evelyn tightly by the wrist. Her touch was searingly warm, a stark and shocking contrast to the cold dread that was rapidly pooling in Evelyn's stomach. "Grab the puzzle box right now. We are leaving." "Leaving? How exactly?" Evelyn demanded, snatching the heavy metal sphere from the desk and hurriedly slipping it into the deep reinforced pocket of her tweed jacket. "There is only one staircase, and they are already coming up it. We are on the 7th floor, Clara. Unless you brought a pair of functional mechanical wings in your coat, we are completely trapped." "I never trap myself without a viable exit strategy," Clara replied, dragging Evelyn firmly toward the massive, ornate fireplace at the far end of the room. It had not been lit in over 5 decades, sealed off by an incredibly heavy, rust-covered iron grate. Heavy, perfectly synchronized footsteps began to thunder up the spiraling stone stairs just outside the study. The heavy oak door of the sanctum violently rattled as someone, or something, slammed their massive weight against it. The Brass Watch were not just ordinary men. They were augmented brutes, half flesh and half machine, driven by unstable ether cores that made them incredibly strong and completely merciless. "Clara!" Evelyn shouted over the deafening din as the thick wood of the door began to crack and splinter right down the middle. "Stand back!" Clara ordered. She raised her heavy boot and delivered a precise, punishing kick to the exact center of the ancient iron grate. There was a sharp, metallic click, followed immediately by the harsh, grinding sound of ancient gears finally turning after years of dormancy. The stone floor of the fireplace suddenly gave way, swinging downward to reveal a dark, terrifyingly narrow chute that plunged straight down into the pitch-black abyss beneath the Grand Archives. A hidden smuggler's drop? Clara explained quickly, offering Evelyn a breathless, exhilarated grin that made Evelyn's heart race for entirely different reasons. Built during the prohibition of magic in the year 1899, it leads straight down to the underground aqueducts. The study door finally shattered inward with a tremendous, deafening crash, sending massive splinters of oak flying across the room. 3 massive enforcers of the brass watch stood menacingly in the ruin of the doorway, their mechanical, glass-covered eyes glowing with an angry, violent red light. One of them raised a heavy, devastating repeating rifle, aiming the barrel directly at Evelyn's chest. "Jump!" Clara screamed, throwing her arms tightly around Evelyn's waist and pulling her forcefully backward into the dark, the echoing abyss just as the first gunshot violently tore through the air. The deafening crack of the gunshot reverberated down the claustrophobic metal walls of the chute, the bullet tearing through the high collar of Evelyn's heavy tweed jacket and missing her throat by a mere fraction of an inch. The terrifying sensation of absolute freefall swallowed her screams. Clara maintained an iron grip around Evelyn's waist, pressing their bodies tightly together as they plummeted into the pitch-black abyss. The steep, winding angle of the smuggler's drop tossed them mercilessly from side to side, the smell of ancient rust and damp earth rushing past them in a chaotic blur. After what felt like a lifetime but was likely only 15 seconds, the metal chute abruptly leveled out. They shot out of the narrow opening like a cannonball, suspended in the cold air for one terrifying heartbeat before plunging violently into a pool of icy, stagnant water. The brutal impact knocked all the oxygen from Evelyn's lungs. She thrashed blindly in the freezing darkness, her heavy clothes dragging her down into the muck. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed the back of her coat and hoisted her upward. Evelyn broke the surface of the water, gasping frantically for air, her lungs burning with every desperate breath. Clara stood waist-deep in the underground canal beside her, pushing wet strands of dark hair out of her eyes. Despite the freezing water and the near-death experience they had just shared, Clara still managed to look frustratingly composed. "Are you shot?" Clara asked, her voice tight with genuine concern as her hands quickly patted down Evelyn's shoulders and back, searching for blood in the gloom. "I am whole," Evelyn choked out, shivering violently as the freezing temperature of the underground aqueduct began to seep into her bones. "My jacket is ruined and my reputation is entirely destroyed, but I am entirely in one piece." "We can buy you 100 new jackets," Clara said, stepping closer and wrapping an arm around Evelyn's waist to support her against the current of the dark water. "As for your reputation, you are standing in a dark room with the city's most wanted criminal. I think your days of attending polite tea parties with the High Council are officially over." Evelyn glared at her, though the effect was somewhat ruined by her chattering teeth. "We need to get moving. If the brass watch finds the lever to the drop, they will send heavily armed search parties down here in less than 5 minutes." "Agreed," Clara said, wading forward and pulling Evelyn along the slippery, algae-covered stone pathway that ran parallel to the dark water. "Keep your voice low. The acoustics down here carry sound for nearly 3 miles. They moved in a tense, suffocating silence through the labyrinth of the forgotten lower sector. The only source of illumination came from patches of phosphorescent moss clinging to the crumbling brick walls, casting a sickly, pale green light over the damp architecture. Evelyn had read extensive blueprints of these aqueducts during her early years at the academy. They were constructed nearly 200 years ago to filter clean water into the upper districts, but were abandoned when the ether-powered purifiers were invented. Now, the tunnels belonged only to massive river rats, desperate outcasts, and people running for their lives. As they hurried along, a particularly narrow ledge, Evelyn's wet boot slipped on a patch of slick black sludge. She stumbled forward, a sharp cry escaping her lips as she pitched dangerously toward the deep canal. In a flash of movement, Clara spun around, catching Evelyn firmly by the shoulders and pulling her flush against her chest. The sudden, intense proximity stole whatever breath Evelyn had managed to recover. In the dim, green-tinted darkness, Clara's face was merely inches from her own. Evelyn could feel the rapid, heavy thud of Clara's heart beating against her own chest. She could see the droplets of water clinging to Clara's eyelashes and feel the warm, frantic ghost of Clara's breath against her lips. For one agonizingly long moment, the fear of the governor's enforcers, the cold dampness of the tunnel, and the urgency of their escape all completely melted away. There was only the intoxicating, magnetic pull of the woman holding her. "You are trembling," Clara whispered softly, her dark eyes dropping to Evelyn's lips for a fraction of a second before meeting her gaze again. Her thumbs gently stroked the fabric of Evelyn's ruined jacket. "It is just the freezing water," Evelyn breathed out, her voice barely a whisper. Clara offered a small, incredibly tender smile that sent a fresh wave of heat directly to Evelyn's face. "Liar," Clara murmured. She lingered for exactly 1 second longer than necessary before slowly, reluctantly stepping back. "Stay close to the wall. The path gets treacherous ahead." Evelyn nodded silently, grateful for the dim lighting that hid the fierce blush burning on her cheeks. To ground herself, she reached into her deep pocket to check on their prize. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the puzzle box. Only, it was no longer cold. Evelyn gasped, pulling the heavy sphere out into the open air. The intricate, sweeping engravings etched into the unknown metal were now glowing with a brilliant, pulsing violet light. The warm illumination washed over the damp walls of the tunnel, humming with a faint, melodic vibration that Evelyn could feel vibrating right through her fingertips. "By the old gods," Clara swore softly, stepping closer to stare at the glowing artifact. "Did you do that?" "No," Evelyn replied, completely mesmerized by the shifting patterns of light. The glowing lines were slowly moving across the surface of the sphere, rearranging themselves like a mechanical compass needle constantly adjusting to true north. "It is reacting to the environment. The ambient ether in these old tunnels must be acting as a catalyst. Clara, look at the concentration of the light. It is not just a static map. It is a compass," Clara realized, her eyes widening with a sudden thrill of adventurous excitement. "It is pointing us directly toward the sunken vault. And the light is pulling us deeper underground," Evelyn noted, observing the brightest cluster of violet energy pointing straight down the darkest, most foreboding corridor of the tunnel system. "Then we follow the light," Clara declared, her trademark confidence fully restored. She drew her silver-plated percussion pistol once more, holding it at the ready. "Let us go find out what the governor is so terrified of." They followed the guiding glow of the puzzle box for another 45 minutes, descending deeper and deeper into the bowels of Vermillion. The air grew noticeably heavier, thick with the scent of ancient dust and stagnant magic. Eventually, the narrow tunnel opened up into a massive, cavernous space. Evelyn and Clara stood at the edge of a completely submerged, ruined platform. Above them, grand arches of decaying steel supported a ceiling lost in the shadows. They had arrived at Terminal 7, the grand central hub of the old underground train network that had been completely sealed off during the Great Plague of the previous century. The water here was waist-deep, dark as oil, and unnervingly still. The light points straight across the flooded tracks, Evelyn whispered, gesturing toward a pair of colossal, rust-eaten iron doors on the far side of the terminal. The doors were sealed shut with massive, heavy chains. "We will have to wade across," Clara said, her eyes scanning the dark water with deep suspicion. "Keep your eyes open. Something about this place feels entirely wrong." They stepped slowly off the platform, the dark, freezing water rising instantly to their waists. With every step, the violet light from the puzzle box pulsed faster, as if mimicking the frantic, terrified beating of a trapped heart. They were exactly halfway across the flooded terminal when the unnatural silence was suddenly broken. It started as a low, mechanical hum, vibrating violently through the water and rattling the bones in Evelyn's legs. Then, a massive, deafening metallic groan echoed through the cavern, as if an immense beast made of steel and steam was waking from a century of slumber beneath the surface. The dark water around them began to churn and violently bubble, glowing with a sudden angry crimson light from below. Clara shoved Evelyn roughly behind her, leveling her pistol at the boiling water, as a colossal, segmented mechanical serpent erupted from the depths, its glowing red eyes locking instantly onto the two women. The mechanical serpent loomed over them, a terrifying marvel of ancient engineering. Cascades of dark water poured from its interlocking brass scales as it reared its massive head back, venting a blinding cloud of pressurized steam from the gills along its metallic neck. The deafening roar it unleashed sounded like grinding gears and screaming metal, vibrating through the water with such intense force that it rattled the very teeth in Evelyn's skull. Clara did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She raised her silver pistol, holding her ground in the waist-deep water, and fired 3 rapid shots in quick succession. The bullets sparked brilliantly against the thick armor plating of the serpent's snout, ricocheting harmlessly into the dark recesses of the cavern. The creature did not even flinch. It lunged forward, its massive jaws unhinging to reveal rows of spinning, jagged steel blades. Evelyn threw herself to the left, diving under the freezing surface of the water, just as the serpent's jaws snapped shut exactly where her head had been a moment before. She came up gasping, her lungs burning, the glowing puzzle box still clutched tightly in her freezing fingers. "Bullets are completely useless!" Evelyn screamed over the roaring din of the water. "Its armor is composed of tempered void steel. It was designed to withstand artillery fire during the Great Siege." "I am entirely open to alternative suggestions, Evelyn," Clara shouted back, desperately wading backward as the serpent thrashed its colossal tail, sending a massive wave of dark water crashing over them. Evelyn wiped the toxic water from her eyes, her brilliant mind racing to recall the obscure, dust-covered schematics she had memorized over the past decade. The creature was an automated sentinel, a relic from a forgotten era, which meant it ran on a centralized ether core. She watched the beast coil itself for another strike, the angry crimson light radiating from the deep seams between its armor plates. "The thermal exhaust port!" Evelyn yelled, pointing frantically toward the underside of the creature's massive jaw. "There is a secondary venting valve located precisely beneath its third cervical plate. If you puncture that valve, the internal pressure will rupture its primary ether core." "Under the third plate," Clara repeated, a reckless, utterly breathtaking grin spreading across her face despite the terrifying circumstances. She holstered her useless pistol and reached down to her left boot, drawing a long, wickedly curved trench knife. "Keep its attention focused on you for exactly 10 seconds. "I am sorry. What did you just say?" Evelyn shrieked, but Clara was already moving. The smuggler dove beneath the churning surface of the water, disappearing entirely from sight. The mechanical serpent, so temporarily losing track of its more aggressive target, instantly swiveled its glowing red eyes to lock directly onto Evelyn. The violet light of the puzzle box in Evelyn's hands pulsed frantically, a beacon in the dark that seemed to enrage the ancient machine. The serpent hissed, a sound like a ruptured steam pipe, and launched itself directly at her. Evelyn stood absolutely paralyzed for 2 excruciating seconds before her survival instincts finally kicked in. She scrambled backward, her heavy soaked clothing dragging her down like lead weights. 5, 6, 7. Evelyn counted aloud, her voice trembling violently as the spinning steel blades of the creature's maw closed in. Just as the beast opened its jaws to swallow her completely, Clara burst from the water directly beneath the serpent's chin. Using the creature's own downward momentum, Clara drove the heavy steel blade of her trench knife upward with every single ounce of her strength, burying it deep into the narrow gap beneath the 3rd cervical plate. A high-pitched, agonizing mechanical screech tore through the cavern. Blinding white steam erupted violently from the ruptured valve, scalding the air and completely obscuring the beast. Clara was thrown backward by the force of the escaping pressure, splashing heavily into the water. The serpent thrashed wildly in a blind panic, its crimson eyes flickering erratically before exploding into a shower of dangerous electrical sparks. With one final, shuddering groan, the massive machine collapsed, sinking heavily beneath the surface of the dark water and plunging the cavern back into an eerie, echoing silence. Evelyn rushed forward, her legs burning with exhaustion as she waded through the murky waves to reach Clara. She found the smuggler leaning heavily against a submerged pillar, breathing in ragged, heavy gasps. "Are you injured?" Evelyn demanded, her hands frantically checking Clara's arms and shoulders. "Did the steam burn you?" "I am perfectly fine," Clara managed to say, though she looked incredibly pale in the dim, violet glow of the puzzle box. She looked up at Evelyn, her dark eyes entirely completely sincere for the first time since they had met in the study. "You did not run away." "I could hardly leave you to be eaten by an antique," Evelyn replied, her voice shaking slightly. The adrenaline was finally beginning to crash, leaving her fully aware of just how cold and exhausted she was. She realized her hands were still firmly planted on Clara's chest, right over her racing heart. Neither of them made a move to pull away. "You make a surprisingly excellent criminal, Scholar Vance," Clara whispered, leaning in just a fraction of an inch closer. The space between them felt suddenly charged with an electricity far more potent than the destroyed Sentinel's ether core. Evelyn swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to Clara's bruised lips. "We need to get to the doors," she murmured softly, fighting the overwhelming urge to close the remaining distance between them. "The brass watch will have surely heard that explosion. We do not have much time." Clara nodded slowly, a reluctant sigh escaping her. "Right, the doors." They turned their attention back to the massive rusted iron gates at the far end of the terminal. The heavy chains wrapping the handles looked impenetrable, but as they waded closer, the puzzle box in Evelyn's hands began to hum with a frantic, intense vibration. The violet light beamed forward, projecting a complex, geometric pattern directly onto the center of the heavy chains. "Hold the sphere steady," Clara instructed. She reached out, her fingers hovering just over the illuminated metal. Wherever the violet light touched, the centuries-old rust and dense iron began to dissolve into fine, sparkling ash. Within 30 seconds, the massive chains crumbled away completely. The colossal doors, responding to the ancient magical frequency of the box, slowly groaned outward on their massive hinges, revealing a dark, dry tunnel beyond. The air that rushed out to greet them was surprisingly warm, smelling strongly of dry earth, copper, and blooming electricity. They stepped out of the freezing water and onto the solid, dry stone floor of the corridor. Evelyn shivered violently, her ruined jacket dripping onto the ancient flagstones. They walked in silence for another 5 minutes, following the gentle downward slope of the tunnel until it opened up into a breathtaking, perfectly circular chamber. The walls of the room were entirely lined with thousands of glowing, cylindrical glass tubes, each one containing a swirling vortex of raw, unrefined ether. At the very center of the room sat a sleek, metallic control console, completely covered in strange, glowing runes that Evelyn could not even begin to translate. "This is not a vault," Evelyn whispered, stepping cautiously into the center of the massive room, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief. "Clara, these are incubation chambers. This is a laboratory." Before Clara could respond, the heavy iron doors far down the tunnel behind them slammed shut with a definitive, echoing boom. The entire circular room suddenly lurched, throwing both women to their knees as a low, mechanical grinding noise filled the air. The thousands of glowing ether tubes flared to a blinding brilliance, and Evelyn realized with sudden, absolute horror that the floor beneath them was rapidly dropping. They were standing inside a massive descending elevator, plunging uncontrollably deeper into the earth, straight toward a voice that suddenly crackled through hidden ancient speakers overhead. The voice that echoed through the descending chamber was synthetic, a chilling amalgamation of hundreds of different voices layered over one another. It spoke in the High Imperial dialect, a dead language that had not been spoken in over 800 years. "Genetic and magical signatures confirmed. Protocol 0 Alpha is now initiated. The deep terraforming engine is unlocking." Evelyn struggled to her feet, the metal floor vibrating intensely beneath her boots. The elevator was plunging at a terrifying speed, yet the sheer size of the shaft meant they were descending thousands of feet into the bedrock of the city. She reached out, grasping the edge of the rune-covered console to steady herself. Clara was instantly at her side, her arm wrapping securely around Evelyn's waist. "What is it saying?" Clara asked, her eyes darting toward the hidden speakers. "That did not sound like Governor Silas." "It is an automated greeting," Evelyn translated, her mind racing to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the situation. "It called me a designated archivist. It thinks I am one of the original creators of this facility because I am holding the puzzle box. Clara, this is not just a library of forbidden knowledge. The voice called it a deep terraforming engine. Do you understand what that means?" Clara frowned, her dark eyes reflecting the swirling blue and violet light of the ether tubes. "Terraforming. Changing the earth? Evelyn, are you telling me this machine is what caused the Great Flood 1,000 years ago?" "I think it is the very machine that built our entire world from the ruins of the old one," Evelyn breathed, the historical implications completely overwhelming her fear. "And if Governor Silas gains control of it, he will not just rule Vermillion. He will possess the power to reshape the continents. He could drown the rebel cities in a matter of minutes." The elevator continued its rapid descent, the air growing uncomfortably warm and thick with the smell of ozone. Clara pulled her damp coat tighter around her shoulders, though the gesture seemed entirely subconscious. She looked at Evelyn, the playful arrogance completely gone from her expression, replaced by a raw, unfiltered vulnerability that Evelyn had never seen before. "We cannot let him have it," Clara said quietly, stepping closer until the tips of their boots were touching. The circular platform was vast, yet they stood anchored to one another in the very center. "I came down here to steal a priceless artifact and sell it to the highest bidder on the black market. But I am not going to let a tyrant destroy the world." Evelyn looked up into Clara's eyes, her heart aching with a sudden, fierce affection. For years, she had convinced herself that Clara Thorne was nothing more than a selfish rogue, a chaotic force that existed solely to ruin Evelyn's meticulously organized life. But standing here at the end of the world, Evelyn finally allowed herself to see the truth. Clara was brave, fiercely loyal to her own moral compass, and breathtakingly beautiful in the flickering light of the ancient magic. Without thinking, Evelyn reached up, her trembling fingers gently brushing a wet strand of dark hair away from Clara's cheek. Clara leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. "Why did you really come back for me tonight, Clara?" Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring descent of the elevator. "You could have taken the puzzle box and left me to the brass watch. It would have been the easiest escape." Clara opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto Evelyn's with an intensity that stole the air from Evelyn's lungs. "Because a world without Evelyn Vance is incredibly boring," Clara murmured, her hands coming up to gently cup Evelyn's face. "Because for the last 3 years, every single treasure I stole felt completely hollow compared to the memory of you in Oakhaven. Because I am entirely, hopelessly in love with an impossibly stubborn scholar who thinks she is always right." A sharp gasp escaped Evelyn's lips. The confession hung in the warm air, heavy and intoxicating. She closed the final distance between them, pressing her lips against Clara's. The kiss was desperate and searing, a chaotic collision of adrenaline, fear, and years of repressed longing. Clara responded instantly, her arms pulling Evelyn flush against her body, her mouth opening to deepen the kiss with a fierce, possessive hunger. Evelyn tangled her fingers into Clara's dark hair, anchoring herself to the only real thing in a world that was rapidly shifting beneath her feet. The cold dampness of their clothes was entirely forgotten, replaced by the overwhelming, consuming heat of their shared breath and the electric thrill of finally surrendering to the inevitable. They broke apart only when the elevator suddenly decelerated, the massive gears groaning in protest as the platform came to a jarring, heavy halt. The thick iron doors in front of them hissed open, releasing a cloud of dense, warm steam, as Evelyn and Clara stepped back, their hands still tightly intertwined, their chests heaving as they looked out into the colossal cavern before them. The space was so massive that it possessed its own internal atmosphere, with dark, heavy clouds gathering near the cavernous ceiling. In the center of the space stood a machine the size of a cathedral, a terrifying monolith of spinning brass rings, pulsing ether cores, and massive crystalline conduits that hummed with world-shattering power. "We have to disable it," Evelyn said, her voice shaking as she stared at the terraforming engine. "We have to find the primary control matrix and destroy the connection before Silas can send his technicians down here." They stepped off the elevator platform and onto a narrow glass bridge that suspended over a seemingly bottomless, glowing blue chasm. The bridge led directly to the heart of the great machine. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing sharply in the vast emptiness. They were exactly 20 feet from the central control console when the shadows around them suddenly detached themselves from the walls. 4 figures dropped silently from the metal rafters above, landing gracefully on the glass bridge and entirely blocking their path forward. They wore sleek, form-fitting black armor that absorbed the ambient light, and their faces were hidden behind featureless obsidian masks. In their hands, they held long, vibrating plasma blades that hummed with lethal intent. "The silent hounds!" Clara hissed, instantly pulling her trench knife from her boot and pushing Evelyn behind her. "The governor's personal assassins. They must have followed the elevator shaft down using magnetic grapples." One of the assassins stepped forward, raising his humming plasma blade in a deadly fluid arc, preparing to strike just as the main doors of the cavern violently exploded inward, sending a massive shockwave of searing heat and heavy debris ripping directly across the fragile glass bridge. The concussive wave of the explosion hit the glass bridge with the force of a falling mountain. The transparent floor beneath their feet instantly spiderwebbed with thousands of crystalline fractures before shattering entirely into a million glittering fragments. The four silent hounds, robbed of their footing and caught entirely in the devastating blast radius, were swept over the edge, tumbling silently into the glowing blue chasm below. As gravity seemingly vanished, Clara threw her arms around Evelyn, twisting her body in midair to shield the scholar from the razor-sharp shrapnel raining down around them. With a desperate, feral shout, Clara kicked hard against a massive falling chunk of debris, propelling them forward across the remaining 20 feet of empty air. They crashed violently onto the solid brass platform of the central terraforming engine, sliding across the polished metal just as the last remnants of the bridge disintegrated into the endless abyss. Evelyn gasped for air, her ears ringing with a high, piercing whine. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her trembling hands still clutching the glowing puzzle box. "Well, that was certainly an entrance." A cold, amplified voice boomed across the vast cavern. Through the thick, swirling black smoke of the ruined doorway, Governor Silas stepped forward to the very edge of the severed cliff. He was a towering, terrifying figure, his left arm completely replaced by a heavy, hissing pneumatic appendage. Behind him stood at least 50 heavily armed enforcers of the Brass Watch, their rifles aimed directly at the central platform. But with the bridge destroyed, a gulf of over 100 feet of empty space separated the tyrant from his ultimate prize. "You have been a tremendous thorn in my side, Scholar Vance," Silas called out, his voice dripping with venomous contempt. "But I am a reasonable man. Place the cipher into the control console and activate the engine. Do this, and I will personally guarantee your safety. I will give you unlimited access to the archives and pay you $10 million. You will have 100% of the resources you could ever desire. Defy me, and my men will simply shoot you both where you stand, and I will find another archivist." Clara pulled herself up beside Evelyn, her trench knife clutched tightly in her bleeding hand. She placed herself squarely between Evelyn and the terrifying line of riflemen. "Do not listen to a single word he says, Evelyn. He is going to kill us the second you turn that machine on." Evelyn looked down at the puzzle box in her hands. Its violet light was pulsing with a frantic, rhythmic intensity, perfectly matching the rapid beating of her own heart. She looked across the chasm at Governor Silas, a man willing to drown half the world just to secure his own absolute power. Then she looked at Clara, the thief who had risked absolutely everything, who had thrown away her own freedom simply to keep Evelyn alive. Evelyn knew exactly what she had to do. She scrambled to her feet and rushed to the center of the sleek metallic console. In the very middle of the rune-covered dashboard was a perfectly spherical indentation. Without a single moment of hesitation, Evelyn slammed the glowing puzzle box into the slot. The entire cavern instantly erupted into blinding light. The colossal brass rings towering above them began to spin with a deafening mechanical roar, building an immense, world-shaking momentum. "Excellent!" Silas shouted over the din, a cruel smile twisting his face. "Now, initiate the deep terraforming sequence." "I am an archivist of Vermillion," Evelyn yelled back, her voice ringing out clear and completely fearless. "My sworn duty is to preserve history, not to let a tyrant repeat its greatest tragedy." Evelyn placed both of her hands flat against the glowing runes on the console. Drawing upon every single text, every ancient schematic, and every forgotten language she had ever studied, she bypassed the activation protocols entirely. Her fingers danced across the light, triggering a sequence that had not been used in 1,000 years. "Warning!" The synthetic, layered voice echoed through the chamber, vibrating with a sudden apocalyptic urgency. "Absolute core purge initiated. Total structural dismantling will commence in exactly 30 seconds. Ether containment failing." Silas's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. "Stop her! Fire! Shoot them both right now!" A hail of heavy bullets rained down toward the platform. But the spinning rings of the awakening machine had already generated a massive, impenetrable electromagnetic shield. The projectiles sparked and dissolved into harmless ash the moment they struck the invisible barrier. "Evelyn!" Clara shouted over the blinding chaos, grabbing Evelyn's shoulder as the brass floor beneath them began to violently shake and tear apart. "If this entire engine is going to explode, we need to be literally anywhere else." "The emergency ascension carriage!" Evelyn pointed toward a sleek, cylindrical glass pod nestled directly at the base of the central pillar. "It was designed to evacuate the ancient engineers in the event of a catastrophic core failure." They ran for the pod, the air around them burning with the intense, blistering heat of uncontained magical energy. Clara threw open the heavy glass door, shoving Evelyn inside before diving in right behind her. She slammed her fist against the glowing blue launch panel just as the central core of the terraforming engine reached critical mass. With an earth-shattering shockwave, the massive machine imploded. A terrifying vortex of raw, destructive ether tore through the cavern, instantly vaporizing the cliffside where Governor Silas and his men stood. Simultaneously, the glass carriage shot upward through a secondary vertical shaft, propelled by the massive surge of escaping pressure. Evelyn and Clara were pressed hard against the floor of the pod by the extreme gravitational force of the ascent. They held onto each other with a desperate, crushing grip, surrounded by a blur of rushing stone and brilliant white light as the ancient world below them finally collapsed into absolute ruin, burying its terrifying secrets forever. The violent ascent lasted for 2 agonizing minutes before the carriage burst through the surface layer of the city, crashing into the abandoned courtyard of an old, forgotten cathedral on the very outskirts of Vermillion. The glass doors hissed open, and the cold, crisp morning air flooded the pod. Evelyn and Clara stumbled out onto the overgrown cobblestones, collapsing side by side into the damp, green grass. The torrential rain of the previous night had finally stopped. Above them, the thick clouds were breaking apart, allowing the first brilliant rays of the morning sun to wash over the city skyline. They lay there for a long time, their chests heaving, completely covered in ash, completely exhausted, and entirely alive. Clara was the first to move. She propped herself up on one elbow, her dark eyes tracing the weary lines of Evelyn's face. The smuggler reached out, her thumb gently wiping a smudge of dark soot from Evelyn's cheek. "You just destroyed the greatest historical discovery of the last millennium," Clara whispered, a soft, breathless laugh escaping her lips. "I am fairly certain the High Council is going to revoke your library card." They can have it, Evelyn replied, turning her head to meet Clara's gaze. The heavy burden of her lifelong obsession, the constant need to prove herself to a corrupt academy, had entirely vanished. In its place was a profound, overwhelming sense of freedom. She reached up, weaving her fingers gently into Clara's dark, tangled hair. I think I am completely finished with chasing the past. I would much rather see what the future holds. Clara smiled, a genuinely radiant expression that outshone the dawn itself. She leaned down, capturing Evelyn's lips in a slow, impossibly tender kiss that tasted of rain, adrenaline, and absolute salvation. As the golden light of the new day spread across the quiet courtyard, they held each other close, two former enemies who had survived the end of the world only to find that their greatest adventure was just beginning.